The amplifier was still humming, a low, electric drone filling the empty rehearsal space at Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club in London. It was September 1970, and the man who had redefined what an electric guitar could say to the world was sitting alone on a wooden chair, his white Stratocaster resting across his knees, his fingers motionless on the strings. He was not playing. He was staring at the far wall, where a crack in the plaster ran from floor to ceiling like a river on a map to nowhere. His eyes were open but unfocused. Somewhere outside, London carried on with its evening. Taxis, laughter, the clatter of glasses in nearby pubs. None of it reached him. The hum of the amplifier was the only company he seemed to want. But the silence inside that room held something heavier than sound. It held the weight of 30 days that were about to collapse everything. Most people remember the legend. The burning guitar at Monterey, the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock. He bent and screaming through a wall of feedback until patriotism and protest became the same sound. The albums that rewired how music was recorded, performed, and understood. They remember the icon, the image, the poster on the wall. But the man sitting in that rehearsal space in September 1970 was not the poster. He was 27 years old, and he was drowning in ways that no audience would ever see. To understand what happened in those final 30 days, and you have to understand what had been building for much longer. By the late summer of 1970, Jimi Hendrix was caught in a web of pressures that would have fractured anyone. Legal disputes, management conflicts, contractual nightmares, creative exhaustion, and the relentless expectation of an industry that wanted him to keep being the thing he had already outgrown. Biographies and contemporary accounts describe a man pulled in so many directions that standing still had become impossible, and moving forward felt just as dangerous. The trouble with contracts had been following him for years. Back in 1965, before London, before fame, before any of it, he had signed a recording agreement that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The terms were extraordinarily unfavorable. According to multiple biographical sources, Jimi received a one-time payment and signed away rights that would later generate enormous revenue for others. When his career exploded in England and then worldwide, that early contract became the foundation of legal battles that consumed his energy, his finances, and his peace of mind. By the summer of 1970, the situation had not improved. It had metastasized. There were lawsuits, counter-lawsuits, depositions and meetings with attorneys who spoke in language designed to strip emotion from everything, including music. Jimi was spending time in offices when he wanted to be in studios. He was reading legal documents when he wanted to be reading chord charts. The machinery of the music business had wrapped itself around his creative life like a vine around a tree, and with every passing month, it tightened. But the legal pressure was only one layer. Underneath it ran something more personal, more corrosive. His relationship with his management had deteriorated to a point that several people close to him would later describe as toxic. The details vary depending on whose account you trust, but the broad outlines are consistent across biographies and interviews from that era. Jimi felt controlled. He felt that decisions about his music, his touring schedule, his public image, and his finances were being made without his genuine input. He was the product, and the machinery around him existed to keep the product moving, touring, recording, generating revenue. What the product wanted, what the artist needed, it was secondary to the schedule. And the schedule in those final months was punishing. European tour dates were stacked tight, with little recovery time between performances. Travel was constant. Sleep was fragile. The physical toll of performing at the level Jimi performed, the sheer bodily expenditure of channeling that much energy through a guitar and into an audience night after night, was something that most observers underestimated because it looked so effortless from the front row. But it was not effortless. It was devastating. Accounts from bandmates and crew members describe a man who was visibly exhausted, who slept badly, who carried tension in his body like a second skeleton. There was something else, too. Something that the schedule and the lawsuits and the management disputes could not fully explain. Jimi Hendrix, by the late summer of 1970, was in the grip of a creative crisis that went to the very core of who he was as an artist. And he had spent years building a sound that changed everything. The Jimi Hendrix experience with Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell had been a force of nature, a power trio that rewrote the rules of volume, texture, feedback, and emotional intensity. But by 1970, Jimi had moved beyond that sound. He was hearing something new in his head, something that incorporated jazz, funk, electronic experimentation, orchestral layering, sounds that did not yet have names because no one had made them before. And he wanted to build a new kind of music from the ground up. But the world did not want new. The world wanted the hits. The world wanted Purple Haze and Foxy Lady, and the screaming, burning, theatrical Jimi who set guitars on fire and played with his teeth. Promoters booked him expecting spectacle. Audiences arrived expecting the legend they had already constructed in their imaginations. And every night, standing on that stage with thousands of eyes demanding the past, Jimi felt the gap between who he was becoming and who they needed him to be grow wider. This was not a new tension. Artists have always struggled with the distance between creative evolution and audience expectation. But for Jimi, the stakes were uniquely high. He was not just a popular musician, he was a symbol, a cultural lightning rod in a decade that was tearing itself apart. The 1960s had promised revolution, and by 1970, the promise was curdling. The optimism of Woodstock had given way to the violence of Altamont. Political assassinations, an unpopular war, social upheaval on every front. And in the middle of all of it, Jimi Hendrix was expected to be the sound of hope, rebellion, transcendence, and escape, all at once, every single night, in a different city, for a different crowd, with the same set list. The European tour that occupied his final weeks was troubled from the start. Accounts from those who traveled with him describe disorganized logistics, poor sound equipment at several venues, and interpersonal tensions within the touring party that made every day feel heavier than the last. Jimi was performing with Billy Cox on bass and Mitch Mitchell on drums, a configuration that had its own internal dynamics and unresolved questions about direction. The band of Gypsies' experiment with Buddy Miles had come and gone, and leaving behind a complicated legacy and a New Year's Eve concert at the Fillmore East that some biographers describe as triumphant and others describe as uneven. The question of what Jimi's band should be, who should be in it, what sound they should pursue, remained open and anxious. There was a concert in Aarhus, Denmark on September 3rd. Then Gothenburg, Sweden, and a string of dates that followed like beads on a fraying thread. Contemporary reviews and retrospective accounts paint an inconsistent picture. Some nights were electric, transcendent, everything that a Jimi Hendrix performance was supposed to be. Other nights were difficult. Equipment failed. The sound was muddy. Jimi seemed distant, disconnected, as though his body was on stage but his mind was somewhere else entirely. Perhaps in that imaginary studio where the music he really wanted to make was waiting for him behind a door he could not yet open. So the concert at the Open Air Love and Peace Festival on the Isle of Fehmarn in Germany on September 6th would be the last time Jimi Hendrix performed for a live audience. The conditions were miserable. Rain had turned the festival grounds into mud. The crowd was restless. There were reports of hostility, of audiences who had been waiting in bad weather and were in no mood for patience. Biographies described Jimi taking the stage in conditions that were far from ideal, both technically and emotionally. The performance has been preserved in recordings that circulate among collectors, and opinions about its quality vary sharply. Some hear a man still capable of extraordinary things even under terrible circumstances. Others hear exhaustion, frustration, the sound of an artist reaching the end of a rope that had been fraying for months. After the Isle of Fehmarn, the remaining European dates were cancelled. The reasons given at the time were vague, but the reality, as pieced together from multiple accounts, was straightforward. Jimi was done. Not done with music, never done with music, but done with this particular version of the life that had been built around him. Done with the schedule, the demands, the legal chains, the expectation that he would keep delivering the same experience to audiences who did not know and could not know how much it cost him to stand under those lights. He returned to London, and here, in the final days, and the story becomes quieter, more intimate, and more difficult to tell with certainty. What is known comes from the accounts of people who were with him, from interviews given years and sometimes decades later, colored by grief, memory, and the inevitable distortions that time applies to truth. The responsible approach is to acknowledge what the evidence supports and to resist the temptation to fill gaps with speculation. What the evidence supports is this. Jimi spent his final days in London moving between social gatherings, recording sessions, and private moments that few people witnessed. He was staying at the Samarkand Hotel in Lansdowne Crescent, Notting Hill. He visited friends. He played music informally. He attended a party at a flat in the area. He was seen by multiple people in the days leading up to September 18th, and the accounts of his mood vary. Some describe him as contemplative, quiet, even peaceful in certain moments. Others describe agitation, sadness, a sense of being overwhelmed by circumstances that offered no clear exit. There was the ongoing question of Electric Lady Studios. Jimi had invested enormous personal resources into building his own recording facility in New York, a space designed from the ground up to realize the sounds he heard in his imagination. The studio had only recently opened, and Jimi had barely had time to use it before the European tour pulled him away. The irony was cruel. He had finally built the instrument he needed to create the music he was evolving toward, and the machinery of his career kept dragging him away from it. Every day spent on tour was a day not spent in the studio where the future of his art was waiting. The financial pressures surrounding the studio were significant. Building it had been expensive, far more expensive than originally planned. And the costs had created additional stress at a time when Jimi's financial situation was already complicated by legal disputes and management issues. According to several biographical accounts, Jimi was not fully aware of his own financial position, a situation that was itself a source of anxiety. The man whose music generated vast sums of money was uncertain about how much of that money was actually his, where it was going, and who was making decisions about it. In those final London days, and the threads of pressure did not loosen. They converged. The legal battles continued in the background. The management disputes remained unresolved. The creative hunger to move forward, to explore the new musical territories he was hearing in his mind, existed in painful tension with the commercial demands that defined his professional life. And underneath all of it, there was the simple, human exhaustion of a 27-year-old man who had been living at an intensity that most people cannot sustain for a week, let alone for years. There is a detail that several people who knew him have mentioned in interviews over the decades. Jimi carried a notebook. He wrote constantly. Song ideas, lyrics, fragments of melody expressed in words because he did not always have a guitar at hand. The notebook was his private space. The one place where the music could exist without commercial pressure, without audience expectation, without anyone telling him what it should sound like or how it should be packaged. Some of what he wrote in those final days has survived. The fragments suggest a mind that was reaching toward something expansive, something that went beyond anything he had previously recorded. He was thinking about larger ensembles, about blending electric and acoustic textures. It's about compositions that moved through multiple sections and moods rather than following the verse-chorus structures that radio demanded. But the notebook also contained evidence of inner turmoil. Not everything he wrote was about music. Some fragments were personal, reflective, the kind of writing that happens when someone is trying to process experiences that are too large and too contradictory to hold in the mind without putting them on paper. These writings have been published in various forms over the years, and they paint a picture of a man who was deeply sensitive to the world around him, deeply affected by the violence and injustice he saw, and deeply uncertain about his own place in a culture that celebrated him and consumed him in equal measure. The night of September 17th, 1970. This is where the facts become most contested and most sensitive. What is established, supported by the official account and the coroner's findings, is that Jimi Hendrix died on September 18, 1970, in London. The cause of death, as determined by the inquest, was asphyxiation. The specific circumstances have been the subject of extensive discussion, varying accounts, and competing narratives over the decades since. Out of respect for the complexity of the evidence and the seriousness of the subject, it is appropriate to note that the exact sequence of events on that final night remains a matter of historical discussion among biographers and researchers, with no single account accepted as definitive by all parties. What can be said is this. The world lost Jimi Hendrix at 27 years old, an age when most artists are only beginning to discover the full range of what they can do. The music he left behind, the 3 studio albums with the experience, the live recordings, the posthumous releases assembled from hours and hours of studio work, represents only a fraction of what he was capable of creating. The tragedy is not just that he died young. The tragedy is the specific timing. He was on the verge of a transformation. The music he was hearing in his head, the sounds he was beginning to explore at Electric Lady Studios, the compositions sketched in his notebook, all pointed toward a next chapter that the world would never hear. The aftermath was chaotic in the way that the aftermath of sudden loss always is, multiplied by the scale of his fame and the complexity of his business affairs. Legal disputes over his estate and musical legacy would continue for decades. The question of who controlled his music, who profited from it, and how it should be presented to the public became its own long, complicated story that intersected with questions of race, commerce, and the way the music industry treats the legacies of artists who die before they can protect their own interests. But step back from the legal aftermath. Step back from the industry machinery. Look at what those final 30 days actually meant. They meant that one of the most gifted musicians in human history spent his last month on Earth fighting battles that had nothing to do with music. He spent it in legal meetings instead of recording sessions, and he spent it fulfilling tour obligations that drained him instead of creating the work that energized him. He spent it navigating management conflicts instead of navigating chord progressions. He spent it being the icon the world demanded instead of the artist he was becoming. And still, even in those compressed, pressurized final days, he made music. He played. He wrote. He imagined. Even when everything else was collapsing, the creative impulse did not stop. It adapted, went underground. It expressed itself in notebooks and late-night jam sessions and quiet moments with a guitar in a room where nobody was watching or waiting or expecting anything. The music persisted because for Jimi Hendrix, music was not something he did. It was something he was. You could take away the stage, the amplifiers, the audience, the recording contract, all of it, and he would still be there, fingers on strings, searching for the next sound. Decades later, the influence is so vast that it has become invisible, like the air. Every guitarist who uses feedback as a musical element rather than an accident is building on something Jimi established. Every studio engineer who layers sounds in ways that create textures rather than simply recordings is walking a path he carved. Every artist who refuses to stay inside genre boundaries, who insists that blues and rock and jazz and funk and electronic experimentation are not separate countries but neighborhoods in the same city, is carrying forward something that Jimi Hendrix understood intuitively before most people had the vocabulary to describe it. His approach to the studio as an instrument, not just a place where you captured a performance but a creative tool in its own right, anticipated entire movements in music production. The way he used the Stratocaster, bending it beyond what its designers imagined, coaxing sounds from it that expanded the entire language of electric guitar, became the foundation on which generations of players built their own voices. His ear for tone, his obsessive attention to the relationship between guitar, amplifier, effects, and room acoustics established a standard of sonic care that serious musicians still aspire to. But the legacy that matters most might be the one that is hardest to quantify. It is the legacy of creative courage, of refusing to repeat yourself because repetition is safe and profitable, of listening to the music in your head even when everyone around you is telling you to play the hits, of being willing to fail publicly in pursuit of something you have not yet fully grasped, of understanding that art is not a destination, but a direction, and that the most important work is always the work you have not yet done. The amplifier in that rehearsal space at Ronnie Scott's was still humming when someone finally came to tell him it was time to go. Time for the next meeting, the next obligation, the next version of the life that had been constructed around him by forces he could not fully control. He stood up slowly, unplugged the guitar with the careful, almost tender motion that everyone who watched him handle instruments remembered. He placed the Stratocaster in its case and closed the latches. And then he walked out into the London evening, carrying the weight of everything he still wanted to create and everything that was preventing him from creating it. 30 days from the end. And the music in his head was louder than ever, playing songs that no one else would ever hear, in keys that had not yet been invented, for audiences that would never know what they were missing. Sometimes the measure of an artist is not what they accomplished, but what they were reaching for when the reaching stopped. Jimi Hendrix spent his final month reaching for a sound that existed only in the space between what music had been and what it could become. The world got the legend. But the music he was chasing, the music that lived in notebooks and late-night whispers and the private frequency of a mind that never stopped listening, that music belongs to a silence that even the loudest amplifier in the world cannot break.